Hi, this is David at MASH IT. Today we're going to be looking at the new Surface Pro 7 Plus i5 versus i7. Now we've recently reviewed the Surface Pro 7 Plus i7 edition. So as these are so similar, I'm not going to go over the externals or the basics of a Surface Pro. If you're interested in watching that video, you'll find it in the description below, and that gives you much more details on the Surface Pro 7 Plus. This video is going to be focusing purely on the differences between the i5 and the i7 version. Now just to start, I want to quickly talk about the specs of the two before we actually start a few of the benchmarks. Now on the left we have the Surface Pro 7 Plus i5. Now this is the base model with 8GB of RAM and 128GB of SSD. Now on the right we have the Surface Pro 7 Plus i7. This has 16GB of RAM and 256GB of SSD. Now the SSD is now pretty much irrelevant because you can actually take the SSD out and upgrade it. It's relatively straightforward to do that now, and we will be doing a video on that shortly, so please subscribe and hit notifications if you wish to see that video. Now look at these two models side by side. They are both identical externally. The only main differences with these two models, obviously other than the specifications, is the i7 version has a fan and the i5 version is passive, so there's never any fan noise. Now the positives to having no fan noise is obviously the Surface Pro is always silent, and that's great, but it does have a thermal impact. So in tonight's video we're going to be looking at how much of an impact not having a fan is going to have with this i5 model over the fan assisted i7 model. Okay, so we're going to look at the performance of these two laptops. The i5 is on the left, the i7 is on the right. We're going to just start off quickly just by running Cinebench to see how they boost and whether the i5 without a fan starts throttling a lot quicker than the fan-assisted i7. So let's set off Cinebench on both at the same time and we'll look at their behaviour. Now Cinebench has started. I've got the CPU meters up for both. The i5 at the moment is kicked in nicely at 3.8 GHz across all cores, and the i7 has got 3.9, so 100 MHz faster than the i5, so not a big deal initially, but obviously I think as it heats up we're going to see the i5 dip down a lot quicker than the i7. Okay, so they're both running at 30 watts, and at 30 watts we're getting 3.4 GHz on the i5 and 3.5 GHz on the i7. So first run is completed, and the scores are very similar. The i7 has scored 50 points more than the i5. I'm going to run it a second time because obviously I want to heat the machines up. They do the initial boost up to 40 odd watts, 40 to 45 watts, and then quickly drop back down to 30 watts. Now the fan has kicked in. They were on the second run of Cinebench. The fan has started to kick in on the i7, so this is hopefully where we'll see the performance pulling ahead on the i7. Obviously, fanless i5, completely silent. Now we're at 88 degrees on the i5, 90 degrees on the i5 going up to, and 85 on the i7. But both still pulling 30 watts currently. Okay, now nearing the end of the second run, the i5 has dropped down to about 16 to 17 watts, whereas the i7 has only dropped down to 22 watts. So you can see now that the i7 is pulling ahead. And at 17 watts, we're getting 2.5 gigahertz as opposed to 3 gigahertz on the i7 at 22 watts. So now we can see this is where the i7 should start pulling ahead. So on the second run, there's about 170 points between them. The i7 was 170 points faster than the i5. So it's starting to pull ahead now. We're going to do a third run, and then we'll probably just stop at that. So now that they've throttled back, so the temperatures are much more comfortable, 67 on the i5 and between 71 and 74 on the i7. We're still at 17 watts on the i5 and 22 watts on the i7. Okay, so they finished the third run on Cinebench R20, and you can see now that the actual performance difference has widened quite significantly. 1,941 on the i7, so that has throttled back a bit from the original, but the actual i5 has got 1,558 points, so there's about 25% difference between these two scores on this long-term Cinebench run. What this basically means is, on day-to-day use and short bursts of CPU performance, you're not really going to see a difference between the i5 and the i7. So only when you're using a long-term load will you see a larger benefit of the i7 over the i5. So if you're using rendering or simulations or anything complex that's going to give you a long-term load on that CPU, are you going to get the benefit of this i7 over the i5 model? Day-to-day use, it's a wash. Okay, so following on from our Cinebench test, We're now going to run a real life project in DaVinci Resolve, which is a video editing software that we use to encode our videos, and running a 5-minute video on both of these machines at the same time. So you can see by looking at the task manager on both these machines that the i7 model is running about 500 gigahertz faster than the i5 model over the long-term boost of this project. And that is because the fan has fully kicked in on this i7. Now for the first minute or so, they will both kick up to about 3.8 gigahertz where you get the short-term turbo boost. And then the temperatures will rise. You can see by the task manager that the CPU is flat out on both of these machines. After about just over a minute, that's when the short-term turbo boost sort of drops out because of the temperatures. And then we come down to these are the sort of the long-term speeds, 2.4 and 2.9. Now, obviously, these aren't machines that you're going to be rendering video on. This 5-minute project would probably take us about 2 minutes on our workstation. This is apparently going to take about 12 minutes from start to finish on these machines. Now, we will skip through most of this and give you the time results at the end, but it's usable in a pinch. So the actual editing side seems fine on these machines for light 1080p editing, but the rendering times are particularly slow. Okay, so we're at the end of the render. The i7 finished a little while ago. That completed this job in 10 minutes and 5 seconds. And then, quite a lot after the i7, the i5 finished with 12 minutes and 2 seconds. This is where obviously the fan-assisted i7 obviously makes it more worthwhile over the i5 for a long-term job like this. But in all honesty, I mean, I wouldn't want to be doing this regularly on these machines because they're both pretty slow compared to a desktop. Now the i7 also has 16 gigabytes of RAM as well as the fan, which will give it an advantage over the i5's mere 8 gigabytes as well, so that will help. So now we're going to run Geekbench 5 on both of these models on mains. The i5 scored 1,370 on the single core. The i7 scored 1,542, so that was quite a nice improvement on the i7 over the i5 there. This is quite a short test. And the multi-core scored 5,194 on the i5 and 5,622 on the i7. So in Geekbench, it's quite a nice improvement on the i7 over the i5. So now that we're moving on to the GPU side of Geekbench, the OpenCL test, these both have the G7 Intel Xe graphics, but there's still quite a large difference here. The i5 scored 15,029, whereas the i7 scored 18,717. So there's a large difference in the actual graphics score on these models. And that also shows again in Timespy. The i5 scored 1,454, whereas the i7 scored 1,775. You can see as well the graphics score was 1,318 on the i5 as opposed to 1,593 on the i7. The CPU score again was 3,532 on the i5 to 5,071 on the i7. So when you're fully loading the GPU and the CPU, you can see there's quite a big difference between the i5 and the i7. So to test out the 3D on both of these laptops, we're running Unigen Valley with MSI Afterburner overlay running so that you can see how they're performing. This is the Extreme HD preset on Unigen Valley, and you can see from the start that both consume about 18-19 watts. We're getting 13 frames per second on the i5 and about 16 on the i7. So it's performing a little bit better straight away, and this is before any throttling. Now I'm going to run the benchmark and we're going to see how they go over the course of this benchmark. Okay, so we finished the benchmark. What surprised me is how well the i5 held up throughout that benchmark. It consistently held its 18 watts and the temperatures are pretty good at about 63 to 65 degrees. I was expecting it to throttle back a bit more. The i7, so the fans have kicked up, but you're not getting a great deal more wattage. But it seems to be running at higher GPU clocks on the i7 anyway. And that gives us a score of 669 on the i5 and 803 on the i7. So the i7 is just naturally faster even without that higher wattage. Right, so just to finish off the performance testing, we're going to do some testing on battery. I've had a few people asking me how do they perform whilst on battery mode. So I'm going to just do a Geekbench on battery. Now this is on firstly the power mode on battery recommended setting on both machines. Right, let's let these go. So quite a big difference to the actual mains performance. 813 single core on the i5, 826 on the i7, with a multi-core score of 3,415 on the i5 and 3,716 on the i7. So that's quite heavily throttled to preserve your battery life. I'm going to now switch it to max battery and just try that again and just see if we can get full performance on battery. So here we go. This is the max performance on the Windows Mobility power slider. And you can see that on the max performance on battery, we're getting this pretty much the same scores as we're getting on mains. So if you do need that full performance on battery, you can have it, but it will annihilate your battery life. So as these machines are so similar, the same batteries, but just obviously the slightly different processor, I tested the battery life. I used them for an hour and a half, wirelessly streaming YouTube music at 50% brightness, 40% speakers, so that we had exactly the same settings between the two. And over the course of that hour and a half, there was 1% battery difference between them. The i5 finished that hour and a half with 84%, and the i7 finished with 83%. So in all honesty, the battery life is pretty much a wash with both of these machines. And from our original review of the i7, we got about 7.5 hours of battery life with the i7 model. So you're probably talking maybe nearer 8 with the i5. Both pretty good battery life on these machines, but certainly not exceptional like some of the new M1 MacBook Pros and some of the other Ultrabooks that we've got out there. Right, so in conclusion, looking at this i5 versus the i7, obviously the i7 does perform better, but only really in long-term full load scenarios or on the GPU. In light use and day-to-day use, office applications and a lot of other applications, they'll both feel as snappy as each other. So the i5 cost me £850, whereas the i7 cost £1,388, so a whopping £538 difference between these two machines. And for that extra money, you're getting double the RAM with 16 gigabytes of RAM on the i7, double the storage, so 256 gigabytes on the i7, whereas 128 on the i5, and obviously the i7 CPU with a fan as opposed to fanless. Now the SSD is kind of a moot point nowadays because you can actually change that yourself, and that is something we're going to do in a follow-up video. So don't buy the i7 because you want more storage. Do it yourself. It will save you an absolute fortune. The only reason you're going to be wanting to pay an awful lot more for this i7 is because you know it's going to be your pretty much one and only work machine and you're going to be using it for extended loads, or you really need that 16 gigabytes of RAM. Now you can get the 16 gigabytes of RAM on the i5 model, but it's so expensive on the i5 that it's only an extra, I think, £50 to £100 more to go to the i7 as the i5 version with 16 gigabytes of RAM. So if you want that 16 gigabytes of RAM, give the i5 a skip and go straight to the i7, unless the fan noise bothers you. And that's the other reason to choose the i5 over the i7. Obviously they're both as snappy in day-to-day use, but this one is purely passive. And I have to be honest, using this for quite a while now, I love the fact that the fan just never kicks in. Now in day-to-day work on the i7, also the fan doesn't kick in. It's only on extended loads or graphics load that you hear the fan kick in. But having it completely silent for me is absolute bliss. Well, I hope this helps if you're choosing between the 7 Plus, i5 or i7. If you've got any questions, please drop them down in the comments below and I will get back to you. Also, please like and subscribe and hit the notification bell because we will have more content coming out on these machines and we've got plenty of other laptops coming in for review. Thank you for watching.